of the 40th anniversary of the UN Fund for Victims of Torture. Before we start this ceremony, we ask the people in here to please silence their phones. We greet the presence of all authorities and all people on this act. In 1975, due to egregious human rights violations in Chile, this led to the UN to express their uh, disagreement to the flagrant violations of human rights, even in the institutionalized practice of torture or cruel treatment, inhuman or arrests, incarcerations, and banishment as a result of the mobilization of victims of families, activists of human rights. The Commission of the UN for the Human Rights established a working group to monitor the situation. In 1978, due to the repeated violations, the General Assembly of the UN established the Fiduciary Fund of the UN for Chile to extend the mandate and the geographical approach. The General Assembly of the UN converted in 1981 the Fund for Chile in the Voluntary Contribution Fund of the UN for victims of torture at an international level. To start this ceremony, we would like to invite the Executive Director of the Museum of Memory, Francisco Esteves, to give us a few opening words. Good afternoon. It's an honor for our museum that this activity, as stated here, of commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Voluntary Contribution Fund for the victims of torture. So I was saying it's an honor to have this activity undertaken here on our museum. I would like to point out that for us it's very important to be able to deliver a special greeting to those who are going to be here on site and those who will participate remotely through the new technologies. Particularly Michelle Bachelet, the High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights, Antonio Rejuela, Minister of External Relations, External Affairs of Chile, Marcela Rios, Minister of Justice and Human Rights, Juan Mendez, member of the board of the Fund for Victims of Torture in Ayam Harab, the representative of the regional office of the Human Rights for South America, Aida Rauter, the Subsecretary of Human Rights, Jette Gottfredsen, Ambassador of Denmark in Chile, Afayo Vetano, the resident coordinator of the UN system and director of the OIT as well. And I see people who are very significant with a long history among them. We always neglect to mention all of them. I would like to mention Paz Rojas, who is here with us, and those who worked on human rights, the Commission, PODEPO, and also those who represent the Prevention Committee Against Torture in Chile. And I also think it's significant to mention in a very special way, beyond any protocol, Maria Luisa Sepúlveda. She's the president of the directory of this museum, but it was the executive vice president of the National Commission Against Torture and Political Expression. And this is a very thorough report which shows with all of the data the huge amount of people who suffered political prison or torture in our country. And here obviously we have the full list with all their names, which is around 28,000 people. Evidently, this is a report that can be complemented, but we have to say that what happened in Chile was a systematic violation of human rights, which did not happen only in this country, but in Latin America, and therefore we are in the presence of uh, crime of low humanity, and we have to understand that. We have to highlight as well that we think it's satisfactory that in the project of the new constitution we mention the right to life, and every person has a right to life, and no one should be executed or condemned to death. And it also says in the imprescriptibility and prohibition of amnesty for war crimes, the forced disappearance and the torture, genocide, aggression, and other cruel and inhuman treatments. So there's a political conscience, but also a humanitarian conscience of the urgency of this topic to not to be considered as something of the past, but to be urgent in the present. And for that, this dialogue that happens today will allow to establish that link between our history and the wider history of Latin America and the challenges of today on this important field. So, it's an urgent one as well. So, I appreciate your presence, and let's continue with this dialogue and this meeting that allows us to strengthen the commitment with human rights. Thank you very much. We appreciate the words of Executive Director of the Museum of Memory, Mr. Francisco Esteves. Human rights are inherent to all human beings without distinction of race, gender, nationality, ethnics, tongue, religion, or any other condition. This implies that no one should be submit to torture or cruel treatment or degrading treatment. Now, the High Commissioner of the UN for Human Rights, Ms. Michelle Bachelet Heria, will send us her words in a video, in a remote video.
Buenas tardes. Es un honor dirigirme a ustedes para conmemorar los 40 años del Fondo de Contribuciones Voluntarias de las Naciones Unidas para las Víctimas de Tortura. Hubiera deseado acompañarlos directamente en esta conmemoración, pero actualmente me encuentro en misión. La labor del Fondo para ayudar a miles de víctimas de tortura a través del mundo en su camino hacia la reparación es cercana a mi corazón. Es particularmente significativo que este acto conmemorativo se realice en Chile, el lugar en donde se creó el fondo predecesor, y en esta casa, el Museo para la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos, que exhibe el potencial de la memoria colectiva para reparar el daño causado y prevenir futuras violaciones a los derechos humanos. Agradezco al Gobierno de Chile y al Museo su acogida y por su contribución a la organización de este evento. Es una muestra del apoyo sostenido del Estado de Chile al Fondo, que también es miembro fundador del Grupo de Amigos del Fondo y donante. En 1978, la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas creó el Fondo Fiduciario de las Naciones Unidas para Chile, para proporcionar asistencia humanitaria, legal y financiera a las personas cuyos derechos humanos habían sido violados por su detención o prisión en Chile, a las obligadas a abandonar el país y a sus familiares, con el objetivo de universalizar el mandato del fondo. En 1981, la Asamblea General creó el actual Fondo de Contribuciones Voluntarias de las Naciones Unidas para las Víctimas de Tortura. Actualmente, el fondo apoya proyectos de organizaciones de la sociedad civil que proporcionan ayuda directa a las víctimas de tortura y a sus familiares. En 40 años de existencia, el fondo ha otorgado más de 5.000 subvenciones a organizaciones en 120 países en todas las regiones del mundo por un total de $200 millones. Solo este año el fondo contribuye a que más de 46.000 personas reciban servicios básicos mediante el apoyo a 186 proyectos en 93 países. En el 2021, el fondo desembolsó 8 subvenciones de emergencia, beneficiando a casi 2.200 víctimas de la tortura en 8 países. Muchas de las personas beneficiarias que sufrieron torturas se encuentran en una situación de vulnerabilidad o exclusión. Este año, 32 proyectos beneficiarios del fondo se encuentran en América Latina. Desde su creación, el fondo ha apoyado diversos proyectos en la región que han respondido a distintos contextos y patrones de tortura durante las últimas 4 décadas, asistiendo a sobrevivientes de tortura y sus familiares en el contexto de dictaduras, conflictos armados o en el marco de detenciones policiales o detención en centros penitenciarios. En algunos países, el fondo brinda apoyo a organizaciones formadas por madres y familiares de personas desaparecidas, cuya incansable búsqueda por la verdad y justicia son un ejemplo para todos. Mi tributo y solidaridad para todas ellas. El fondo ha jugado un rol decisivo para complementar los servicios de los estados y el fortalecimiento de los mecanismos de rehabilitación en todo el mundo. Esto se ha hecho a través de apoyo a proyectos de organizaciones de la sociedad civil que asisten directamente a las víctimas de tortura y sus familiares. Todo esto ha sido posible gracias a la generosidad de los donantes del fondo a lo largo de su historia, sumado al apoyo del grupo de amigos del fondo, de creación más reciente del 2019, actualmente presidido por Dinamarca y Perú, a quienes agradezco. A pesar de la generosidad y los logros, las necesidades superan el apoyo recibido. Por ejemplo, este año, si comparamos el monto de las solicitudes de subvenciones recibidas con la cantidad de donaciones que se elevan a 10,5 millones de dólares americanos, se vislumbra un déficit de 2,8 millones de dólares. Aliento, por tanto, a los estados a renovar su compromiso con el fondo y a incrementar sus donaciones. Por otra parte, en un contexto mundial de reducción de espacio cívico, en un número creciente de países, las organizaciones apoyadas por el fondo sufren diversos tipos de presiones y represalias a causa de la ayuda que ellas proporcionan a las víctimas de tortura. En tal contexto, el apoyo del fondo es imprescindible. Concluyo celebrando el rol de las personas defensoras de derechos humanos, incluyendo a los aquí presentes, quienes muchas veces, con sacrificio personal, han contribuido de manera decisiva con los esfuerzos de los Estados y las Naciones Unidas para prevenir y combatir la tortura. Muchas gracias.
One of the big challenges for the authorities here is to guarantee the respect and dignity for people, justice, reparation, and guarantees that this will not happen again. We would like to invite the Minister of External Affairs of Chile, Ms. Antonia Urrejola Noguera, to come to the stage. Good afternoon. Right, I'm a little lost here. Good afternoon to everyone. I would like to say hello to Francisco Esteves for receiving us here. My colleague, Miss Minister of Justice, Subsecretary Heide. I always get your last name wrong, but I would like to say hello as well. And experts who are here, the ambassadors who are also here, very important. And I will also like to say hello to the authorities here and the people from the controllership, Alex Basic, and the director of human rights, Thomas Pascual, who work on these topics. And I have to highlight that. And of course, I would like to say hello to the representatives of the NGOs and also the victims who are present here today. It's an honor for me to address you on these activities of commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Fund for the Victims of Torture. As we all know, and Francisco already said this, as we all know, the creation of this fund is linked to the history of our country. as a continuer of the fiduciary fund of the UN for Chile. During these 40 years, the fund has become as an exceptional activity for direct reparation for victims of torture and their families everywhere in the world. We're honored to contribute to the fund and its beneficiaries, and we restate our commitment to it. For Chile, the creation of this fund has a strong symbolism with its past, a dark past that has always left scars on so many people, families, and the whole society. But also, we have the commitment to deliver all of our efforts for the prevention, sanction, and redress of the acts of torture wherever this happens. This commitment also inspires us to move forward with the memory, justice, and reparation, and guarantees that this will not happen again. All human rights violations occurred during the dictatorship, but also those that have happened since the return to democracy. On this last part, we have challenges that show that the practice of torture and institutional violence are sadly not only linked to authoritarian processes. In democracies, there is also torture happening, and this requires to be more alert to this. If torture is generally unacceptable, it is more unacceptable during democracy, where this is done to prevent torture. So we have to pay attention. And that, in that sense, the commitment of the Chilean state has a central axis on agenda of human rights with a policy of state in terms of reparations for uh, victims of the torture on the dictatorship. For we know that redressing this for the victim, their family, and the society is very complex. So therefore, the integral redress and the preservation of the historical memory, as well as the individual memory, have a key role on the guarantee that this will not happen again. And also, besides the historical memory, we are today in a place that asks us to look at the past, but also asks us to think of a future that is set on the foundations of the lessons about the horrors that were lived and learned. As a state, we have full conscience about this commitment at a national and international level. Important steps have been made on the typification of the crime of torture and the creation of a mechanism of prevention whose members are here with us today. At an international level, since 2014, we're part of the main countries of the initiative of the Convention Against Torture, an instance that deals with the ratification of this with Denmark, Fiji, Ghana, Indonesia, and Morocco, all of them located in different regions of the world. The beginning of the initiative is that states help states, and it works on the basis that no state has a perfect record in the application of the Convention Against Torture, the context on which this offers technical support to the states to ratify and apply to the convention with the highest degree of success possible. So we would like to highlight one thing that Chile has deemed as very important for investigation and gathering of information, known as the Mendes principles, based on the ex-relator Juan Mendes, who is a master for many of us here, myself included. These principles are a clear showing that states have to help to prevent torture, to change the mentality of our agents with innovative mechanisms and with an integral approach with ethical, legal, educational, practical, and structural changes. Dear friends, as a state, we have to react to be firm without ambiguities to the violations and abuse. So that's why Chile ratifies their commitment to the integration of human rights at its universal features and the interaction within the system. So let me finish by paying homage to everyone who contributed to setting up the fund, torture survivors, relatives, and activists of human rights of our country and the region, who along these 4 decades have helped a lot to combat torture and to redress the consequences and to avoid its practice. So we appreciate this legacy with the symbolism of doing it in a country like Chile with a history that is linked to this initiative, which also re- shows the development of the regional system of human rights to combat, redress, and prevent torture. Let me finish by paying homage to all of the victims and families that this museum makes presence of, those who have continued their fight, those who are no longer with us, or those who didn't survive. So let me finish with a homage to the victims and relatives who have raised their voice, but also for those victims who kept silence, and even for those silences that still want to be heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister for Foreign Affairs. As many know, this transmission, this ceremony, is being live broadcasted, and there are certain things about the live transmission that are very important. For the next few people that are going to address the public, please speak directly to the microphone so that the streaming can be heard across 5 continents. One of the objectives of the goal of the fund for victims of torture is to promote the right for redress, including rehabilitation and justice for victims of torture in Latin America through stories that show the need of medical, judiciary, humanitarian, psychological support. We would like to invite the Minister for Justice and Human Rights, Mrs. Marcela Rios Tobar, to address the audience. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to join the words of my predecessors, first of all, to congratulate the fund and everyone that is a part of this global initiative that along these 4 decades has had such a meaningful role supporting victims, supporting organizations of human rights, civil society organizations that not only protect and prevent violations of human rights, but they contribute in the complete redress and accompaniment of victims in their search of memory, truth, and justice. So, a deeply felt thank you for the work that each and every one of you does in this UN fund. I would like to thank thank our host Francisco Esteves. Thank you to the museum and everyone working in this space. Also, one of the big testimonies of lessons learned that our country has shown in the issue of human rights. I would like to thank also the presence of our colleagues from the UN with us today, Fabio Bertranu, among others, here from the Undersecretariat of Torture and my colleagues in the ministry, and also those who are here. And I would like to thank you also, along with our Undersecretary. I did learn how to pronounce her last name, and she's used to have her last name mispronounced. But we got to share with our colleagues here today from different countries, from Latin America, from Mexico, from Bolivia, from Brazil, from Guatemala also, and to hear their experiences and also receive the reflections on the process that we are today encouraging here in Chile. Once again, thank you so much for your time, for your dedication, for the space, but also for the lessons learned that you shared with us. As we were told, Chile is a country that has had to learn painfully through a dark period of dictatorship and violations of human rights, which consequences are still with us. These consequences are still lived and experienced by family members of disappeared detainees that haven't been able to be found, of political executed, of thousands of victims of torture, detention, and exile. Many families that suffered in the most affected communities by human rights are families that are particularly vulnerable. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we received joyfully, but also with a feeling of shame that after 4 decades, finally, we had a resolution regarding the execution of 38 country people and students in Paine. Finally, the Supreme Court made the resolution regarding the responsibility of 11 militaries, and the joy comes from finally achieving justice, but still you feel anguish because in the road of justice we have seen wives, mothers, brothers, sisters, families that have died looking for justice, looking for truth and redress. And because of this, our government is committed and has emphasized their commitment to human rights, because we know that this is not only about testimonies. This is not just about symbols. Words are not enough. Regulations are not enough. Statements are not enough. We need to be able to show with concrete facts our commitment with the issue of human rights. And as we were told, this is very complex. About the violations of human rights during the dictatorship, we are committed to prioritize. Our president told us a few weeks ago the priority that this plan has, a national plan that looks at being responsible of this biological impunity that we are facing, of this reality that we are facing with victims, with family members of victims that are dying, with witnesses that many times are gone, and with perpetrators that are also disappearing. We need to accelerate the processes. We need to accelerate the search processes and the identification processes. We need to accompany family members and make a reality that the obligations of and responsibility of the search is not just about the family and organizations, but is in the first place a responsibility of the government. And we are very committed to this, and hopefully we can show you the results of these efforts. But as we talked about yesterday, and as we heard all their comments, our country has the sad experience of having lived one of the deepest crises regarding human rights in democracy that has showed us again the dark areas in those parts that reveal that we haven't learned from the past mistakes enough, that we didn't make the necessary progress in the reforms of institutions of the state, that we have huge challenges in terms of reforms and in the way that the police works, how the criminal system works, in the accompaniment of victims, in the criminal persecution of human rights violations. And this is why a month and a half ago, we launched a comprehensive agenda in the issue of human rights and human rights violations because of the social outburst that happened a few years ago in our country, where we are working with a set of challenges. The Undersecretary with Undersecretary Capellay, will lead a comprehensive roundtable of redress that will start with a dialogue with victims, not just a dialogue, but it's victims and organizations that are going to be able to state and discuss what are the redress needs. As a country, we have learned from different experiences that have happened in the past that clear the path for truth that have been perceived as elitist mechanisms, downward, uninclusive, or not at all inclusive, without hearing the different and diverse territories, genders, ethnicities, and we want to learn about those processes to make a different process that will begin now in July, and hopefully organizations and advocates can walk with us in this journey. But we need to do more in justice. We've been working on a process to create a special prosecutor's office of human rights. We are working with the criminal persecution of those people who manifested themselves during the social outburst, and we will keep working on this agenda with a lot of conviction that this is what is just. And this is something that is required to heal the wounds of the past. So thank you and congratulations, and confirm the commitment of our country to keep participating in these feedback dialogues between organizations with different state institutions. Thank you so much for having us, for welcoming us. And I have to excuse myself. I'm traveling to Europe in a few hours, so unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to stay here for the whole meeting. But our undersecretary is the best representative for this issue, so thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Minister. Given that this is an event that is being broadcasted through social media, we have had some greetings. Greetings from the NGO of Human Rights for the Well-being and the community of former political prisoners. Among the beneficiaries of this fund, we can find defenders and advocates of human rights, people that are not free, boys, girls, and teenagers, refugees, immigrants, family members of forced disappearance, indigenous peoples, victims of gender and political violence, members of the LGBTQ plus community. And now we would like to invite you to watch a video done by the UN team in this 40th anniversary.
Cierto es que aquí hay, no solo sobrevivieron a las torturas, aquí mataron, aquí asesinaron gente.
On m'a amené dans la voiture, bon, comme on m'avait bondé là, je sais pas, là on m'avait amené.
جل هموشي خرابتر كتو كسيكي باق بي هيت شتيكي دلنبي بلان بيد بلان تو اويه.
El público en general cree que es un proceso de interrogación y que piensan que es algo que duele momentáneamente y se acaba. Y realmente así no es como funciona la tortura. Tiene que ver con violar la dignidad de la persona que está siendo interrogada. Es tortura por eso mismo.
In the beginning of the 1980s, there was very little support for people trying to go against torture. Nothing could have been done without the courage of the people who had been tortured, people who were forced to go into exile, whose family has disappeared. They pushed to create mechanisms in the UN to prevent, to stop these violations.
Nos encontramos con mucha solidaridad. Fue una familia nueva para nosotros, que nos dieran espacio para hablar.
The fund has been around for 40 years. We are supporting at least 46,000 victims of torture in all continents of the world.
En los sobrevivientes de tortura, uno ve efectos crónicos del trauma, síntomas que son persistentes a través de la vida. Las necesidades de una víctima de tortura son muchas y va a necesitar cuidados especiales, médicos, psicológicos, de servicio social y de abogados.
When individuals are tortured, it's not just that individual. Their family will be affected, their community will be affected, the society is affected. And we need to help all of those people as well.
En general, los seres humanos tienen recursos a hacer frente a la adversidad. Lo que sí es importante es que tienen que ser apoyados y facilitados por otros.
Setback is inevitable. A smell, a voice of somebody, anything can remind you of your traumatic past. Rehabilitation or therapy give you key on how you can react to that setback.
Là, j'ai fait sortir le problème qui était caché là. وكولك لا بقول طبي نيوي كي كتير هاليجري هاو كارمبي أو كولم سوغابو باركم سوغابو.
J'ai pris confiance en moi et j'ai posé la question de savoir que sera mon demain.
Now, I would like to introduce a reference for everyone. Mr. Juan Mendez, lawyer and activist of human rights, distinguished by his work on behalf of political prisoners and member of the board for the Fund for Victims of Torture. Please. Thank you so much. The Voluntary Fund for the UN for Victims of Torture that I represent in this act wants to facilitate the road to redress for torture victims, supporting different organizations that provide medical assistance, judicial and documentation services. These services are responsibility of the governments according to the international law. The project of civil society supported by the fund contribute to the realization of the 5 elements of redress established in Article 14 of the Convention Against Torture of those who don't have the will or the capacity to meet their obligation of guarantee this reparation. Plus, some projects are also contribution to comply with the states with their legal obligations in the issue of reparations, particularly projects of legal representation of torture victims, including strategic litigation, but also projects of psychotherapeutic help and medical help that allows victims of torture to overcome their trauma and find the strength to demand their rights before national institutions, and documentation projects that are crucial for fighting against impunity. Regarding this objective, the fund ensures that these organizations know and use the manual about research regarding torture and degrading treatment known as the Istanbul Protocol, which revised version will be published on June 29th by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The fund has an approach that is focused on the victims, that the beneficiaries have to occupy a central place in the design from the beginning of a procedure up to its conclusion, which is the interpretation that this Committee Against Torture has done about the content under Article 14 of this convention. In their comments, the committee has interpreted this clause as following, and I quote, "The committee considers that the term redress used in Article 14 encompasses the elements of reparation. So the wide concept of reparation is restitution, indemnization, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees that this won't happen again. And this is all the necessary measures to obtain this redress because of the incompliance of this convention." In another paragraph, the committee highlights the importance that the victim should be involved in the reparation process and that reestablishing the dignity of the victim is the ultimate goal of reparation. The obligation of the state of repairing this damage caused by torture is found within the guarantees of human rights in the American Convention on Human Rights in Article 3 on the International Pact of Civil and Political Rights. The conventions about torture, like the Inter-American Convention Against Torture and the UN Convention Against Torture, are also part of this obligation. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, interpreting the Articles 8 and 25 of the American Convention about Human Rights, has established that, and I quote, "Regarding redress of torture victims, the state should offer the possibility of claiming and the access of measures that contemplate the compensation and rehabilitation." End quote. The court also deducts from these sentences the right for truth that is assumed in the rights of the victims or their family members to obtain from any organization of the state clarification about the violations and the responsibilities according to this. Comprehensive reparation that is owed to torture victims is crucial for the state to end torture. This is why, besides reparation, victims of torture have the right to different benefits through habeas corpus and similar bodies to control judicially that the detained person is not object of torture or mistreatments, including conditions of detention that are not human. Plus, the victims have the right to a particular rule that is not only based on the fundamental rights of a due process, a fair trial, and innocence presumption, but also wants to discourage torture and mistreatment in all of its ways. The state is forced to investigate and punish every torture or degrading treatment. This is a fundamental principle of international human rights that find amnesties illegal. And these measures avoid immunity. The damage caused by torture has the right to restitution as the first goal. This means an effort to go back to the status quo from before the victim was tortured. It's difficult to conceive ways to comply this precept because the tortured person will never be the same again. But insisting in the Convention on Rehabilitation is inspired precisely by this objective, because rehabilitation is not just physical but also psychic, psychosocial, and legal. This is why, besides the kinds of compensation for material damage, and because of all the pain and suffering experienced, we aim at finding satisfaction measures by apologies, social rehabilitation of the person, and measures of non-repetition when it's about systematic or generalized tortures. The committee of this fund has set these priorities for this year. Gender violence, that is equivalent to degrading treatments, the degradation of medical treatment, medical forced treatment, even in prisons, excessive use of force that's equal to torture, especially coming from peaceful movements, attacks that are equal to tortures against the defenders of human rights that work under restrictive conditions or with retaliations, including retaliations because of their collaborations with the UN. On the International Day for Support of Torture Victims, we renovate our commitment in supporting survivors of torture by any means possible. Only this year, the UN Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture has contributed to transforming the lives of 46,000 survivors of torture. With the support of this fund, civil society organizations offer survivors of torture of all social walks of life to restore their hopes and rebuild their lives. Thank you so much.
We appreciated the words of Juan Mendez, member of the board of the Fund for Victims of Torture. Next, we will have Mr. Janjarab, who have loved to be here, but due to a health situation, he has not been able to visit Chile. The representative of the regional office of the UN of Human Rights for South America, we will have a remote word from him from Uruguay.
Muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Mis cordiales saludos a las autoridades presentes, a nuestros amigos del Museo de la Memoria y Derechos Humanos, distinguidos y distinguidas panelistas de Guatemala, México, Argentina, Bolivia, Brasil y Chile, señores embajadores, colegas de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado. Como representante regional, como del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para América del Sur, es para mí un honor compartir esta jornada con ustedes, aunque lamento que haya tenido que ser virtual. Es muy grato tenerles a todos y todas reunidas hoy en esta ceremonia convocada por nuestros colegas del Fondo de Atención a Víctimas de Tortura, que ha tenido un rol tan importante en Chile y en la región. Este trabajo ha sido y sigue siendo un tema principal para nuestro mandato. Dando una mirada hacia la historia reciente, diría que la recuperación de la democracia, después de vivir dictaduras en muchos países de la región, significó la superación de la práctica sistemática de tortura. Sin embargo, aún no hay ningún país que esté completamente libre de ella, a pesar de la absoluta prohibición de la tortura en el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos, contenida en normas de altísimo nivel de consenso universal. Aún así, superar resabios de autoritarismo, cambiar usos y permear a todos los rincones la cultura del respeto absoluto de la dignidad humana es una tarea continua, particularmente en el contexto de la profunda desigualdad socioeconómica, del clasismo en los países de América Latina, Como bien se sabe, persiste un grado bastante alto de tolerancia a los malos tratos que se resume en la frase de que la policía sabe a quién golpear. Esto es, a los presuntos delincuentes, los marginados, los pobres. Observando lo que sucede en nuestros países, notamos que tenemos varios puntos débiles, es decir, de frágil protección contra la tortura y otros tratos o penas crueles, inhumanos o degradantes. Existen instancias en las cuales persisten casos y no tan aislados de tortura y malos tratos. Para mencionar algunos de ellos, cito como ejemplo las primeras horas de detención, el cumplimiento de condenas privativas de libertad en cárceles hacinadas, el cumplimiento de prisión preventiva. Asimismo, recordemos que los lugares de privación de libertad, en el sentido del protocolo facultativo de la Convención contra la Tortura, incluyen centros de internación de niños, niñas y adolescentes, adultos mayores, pacientes psiquiátricos y cualquier otro lugar en el que esté recluida una persona por medio de una orden de autoridad de la cual no se les permite salir libremente. Estos espacios en los que hay una dependencia muy intensa de las personas en custodia han sido además lugares de alta opacidad de cara a la sociedad y de escasa supervisión independiente. El desarrollo de conocimiento científico, por ejemplo, en neurociencia, sumado al desarrollo normativo internacional, mención especial a la Convención sobre los Derechos de Personas con Discapacidad, han marcado un giro hacia la reivindicación del cuidado humano y digno y a la explicitación de deberes de la sociedad y del Estado frente a personas a cargo del cuidado de una institución. Los avances, por importantes que sean, también se pueden mostrar lábiles a la contingencia. Un ejemplo patente y reciente de ello es la pandemia por COVID-19, que nos ha recordado la importancia del monitoreo permanente, del sistema de visitas independientes, de la responsabilidad activa de las autoridades a cargo y del apoyo de los organismos internacionales, así como de las redes de pares que se han unido para superar las dificultades que impuso a la pandemia a las personas que se encuentran en lugares de detención completamente dependientes del Estado y sus posibilidades de ofrecer alimento, agua, salud, contacto con familia, contacto con la defensa, seguridad, entre otros básicos. Debe ser dicho, además, que la fragilidad de la cultura de respeto y de las posibilidades legales e institucionales no afectan a todas las personas por igual. Lamentablemente, son personas con discapacidad, niños y niñas, mujeres, personas migrantes, indígenas y afrodescendientes, personas en situación de calle y marginalizadas en general, quienes más sufren en espacios y culturas no acondicionados para su adecuado respeto y cuidado o no acondicionados del todo. Para terminar, quiero reiterar nuestro compromiso como oficina, continuar con el apoyo a la superación de la tortura y otros tratos o penas crueles, inhumanos y degradantes con todo nuestro vigor. Para ello, será, como siempre, vital contar con el apoyo de ustedes, miembros de la sociedad civil, víctimas, familiares, autoridades y académicos. Muchas gracias por su atención.
and especially indigenous sisters of Guatemala, to denounce the terrible things that have happened on times of peace, but also currently. And that's how I represent the team of psychosocial action ICAP. Since 1997, we have been taking psychosocial actions as responses to the victims and survivors of human rights violations in different contexts, from the internal armed conflict, migration, and territory defense, starting from keeping the evolution and going in the accompanying ICAP deals with social and political actors in front of human rights violations, and also contributing to the empowerment of women in the decision making at a communitary level, and searching for the longing justice, but also the repair and guarantees that this won't happen again. ICAP has dealt with paradigmatic cases in Guatemala in the framework of transitional justice from the strategic litigations, but specifically we have contributed to do psychosocial activities from psycho-jurisdictional strategy. As an example, we have accompanied cases like the genocide Hishin, the Molina Thyssen, and Sebur Sarko, among others. These cases have been vital to keep impulsing because they have allowed the national courts to acknowledge that torture, cruel treatment, inhuman and degraded treatment are institutional practices by the state of Guatemala. As part of a systematic plan during the political violence, especially against the indigenous population, and in the case of women, the sexual torture was a war weapon by using the bodies of women as loot for war. The ICAP thus rehabilitation processes psychosocial with torture victims in context of war and defending the territory, convinced that torture has effects at an individual, familiar, and social level, and this way these have to be dealt with at an individual level with survivors of torture. We have services like medical attention by considering that the survivors still live the physical impacts of torture, and also the conditions of poverty and extreme poverty where they are found, which intentionally the state of Guatemala has to keeps vulnerating them. Another of the services is the psychological one, how the individual therapies and groupal therapies to share experiences that allow for the reconstruction of their life projects and mechanisms for dealing with this, and the logic of defending this and doing the exercise of their human rights as it should be. The work that we develop is part of a social rehabilitation, and that's why we also offer services to the families of women as their support network. We work with the children of these women from dealing with the transgenerational trauma, considering that sexual torture happened to their mothers, especially, does not only have a direct impact on women, but also on the families and, of course, in society in general. We also provide spaces for formation and sensitization with young people, considering that they are the legacy and a generation that can contribute so much for society to reach the fair reality for peoples and all the inhabitants. And we also work with the spouses of these women, thinking about the hegemonic masculinities, considering that we live in a patriarchal, misogynistic, and racist state. So there's a commitment and historical depth from men to have a fair society. And last but not least, we want to acknowledge the support of the fund that has been given to the work we do from ICAP, because it's been vital for the rehabilitation of torture victims, and these processes can be seen as support, and this has been the most important support for us and for the victims, acknowledging that they still have effects on the present. We also want to acknowledge and to use this space to keep requesting and demanding and to be the voice of those women who are no longer with us, those who are gone, and that sadly never, their voices were never heard, their truths were never heard. So we want to congratulate the fund for betting on this reality and this need that all these countries of Latin America that have not found this justice and to be precisely a reality. So thank you very much for this invitation, for this space, and so greeting to every one of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maudi. We want to present as well Ms. Norma Ledesma Ortega, founder of Justice for Our Daughters and a relative of a victim of torture from Mexico. We invite to the stage her to tell us about her experience. Good afternoon. Thank you for the space. Thank you to the fund that has been very good for us, and for the museum, the founders, the directors. Thank you very much for this space. Thank you. In my country, I come from Mexico. In my country, violence is a permanent tragedy. In 1993, we started to comment the murders, disappearances of women in Juarez. Young women who disappeared, and we found their bodies that were mutilated with visible torture, and many others that were never found. Sadly, I had to live that experience when my daughter Paloma Escobar Ledesma, of 16 years old, went to school and she never came back. 27 days later, I found her body with visible showings of sexual violence and torture, physical torture. That's where the organization that I represent was born. As a worker, I dedicated to defending human rights, not only for my daughter, but for hundreds of families that have been through the same situation. Currently, Mexico, our country, has 100,000 people who are disappeared. Official figures: 11 women are killed every day, according to the official data as well. In Mexico, we have 32 entities of the Federation. I live in Chihuahua, that is on the frontier with the U.S. So in this border, in this place, that's where drugs are trafficked from Colombia, and that's where the drug dealers live, and they have to receive women, which is the human trafficking crime. I would like to thank the fund. I tell you about what we do on these 20 years. On March 29, we turned 20 years old, and what we do is accompany in an integral way the the families that have a situation, a similar situation to mine. As a founder of the organization, and the priority is to accompany them. We talk about justice and integral redress. As a victim, I'm not an expert, but I say that late justice is not justice. A justice that lasts up to 40 years to come is not justice. And the redress, there's no integral redress. These are processes, and I congratulate this country for trying to do this. But over there, we haven't managed. With the fund, what have we achieved? We have accompanied the victims in an integral way with a multidisciplinary team of psychologists, lawyers, social workers, to be able to accompany this process with the victims, walking with them. We won't be able to solve things, but they have to feel accompanied. That was my experience. I needed to feel accompanied, and I didn't have that at the time. With the support of the fund, that the years that have been supporting us, we have been able to come up with this multidisciplinary team and to deal with this monster of impunity. The victims, what do we want as victims? With the support of the fund, we have tried to rebuild, that would be the word. We have bet on this integral accompanying, this multidisciplinary and social accompany, psychological and juridical. That's how we assemble these groups, and we can deal with all of the needs. We bet and we have learned to live by rescuing and picking up the pieces of the soul that are broken with the situation when a family member disappears, when we haven't found them, or when we receive their remnants or what is found from them in a box. That's torture. We leave not only the direct victims but also us as relatives. Daily we live this torture. That's why we have learned to pick up the pieces of the broken soul from the state and also the people who committed the torture, and we put them together with faith, and we take them out of that well, and we pick them up with our teams with hope and faith. We keep walking on this path of pain and blood, but also with hope and faith. So our children, our teenagers, our future can have a better world. So therefore, I would like to thank, on behalf of Justice for Our Daughters, to the fund for these years of support, and our partner says we won't finish because the torture process has no end. There's no closure. There's no conclusion. But we can keep supporting each other, and with the fund, we have been able to rebuild us, to be able to see that the sun can shine again for us at some point, and to leave heritage and legacy for our children. Thank you for this event. I congratulate you because we must not forget, we were looking at the museum and inevitably we could feel the chill of these stories that we keep living every day. Thank you to the fund. Thank you to men and women who allow us to keep going and to pick up the broken souls and to rebuild them for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Norma, so much. Thank you for explaining how torture never ends, but also for showing us that light of hope that is so important. Now we want to invite at the stage to address the right of redress and the obligation of the state to defend this right and the non-repetition, this guarantee that is also needed. The Undersecretary for Human Rights, Ms. Aide V. Reuter Umazábar. When you read it, literally, you can understand it. You can pronounce it other ways, but I understand. Good afternoon. First of all, I'm going to do something that has been a part of me for a long time. First of all, reverse the order, and first I would like to say hello to those who are representing the organizations and victims and direct families, who are those who motivate us and moves us, and who we are fighting for. Also, present authorities and those who come from different parts of the world and from different pains of the soul are with us today. First of all, I want to show my appreciation for this fund. Thank you for offering the opportunity to meet and share feelings and opinions around the issue of torture and the role of the state in the road to redress. The name of this meeting. The fund's work for facing this pain is very difficult. I'm very proud of participating in the commemoration of its 40th anniversary. In fact, the International Day for Supporting Victims of Torture is an important landmark for the Chilean survivors, especially because we have been able to create different actions that in one way or another have paved the way to be today, here. With that reflection, I wish to offer my desires for success for the future. It's very difficult to speak about torture, among many other things, because it makes emerge different images about our weird relationship with the world. It makes us create twisted things about things and beings. We recognize that intellect, creativity, and all kinds of resources are used for creating pain and suffering conscientiously and premeditatedly. Also, a historical view on this issue implies to say that this has concrete results, concrete objects, prioritizing one people over the other. This is why this issue is very uncomfortable for people listening. The knowledge of this reality makes it impossible to go back, and despite the fact that many choose indifference, this is hardly enough. Also, even if there are people that choose to look the other way, the consequences of torture are still there when these have tens and thousands of people, as it is the case of our nation and so many others in the world. The public problem is something that we cannot deny. However, this is an issue of the state, not because of the quantitative dimension. It is also because torture is the opposite of democracy and the opposite of human rights. And this is why it is intolerable if our objective is to promote peaceful cohabitation and collective construction of a future for our country. Having said that, and anticipating June 26th, which is the International Day Against Torture, I would like to point out that this is a right of societies, and especially of victims. The right to truth, justice, and redress, the non-repetition guarantees, and historical memory. It's an obligation of the states to redress from a comprehensive and transformative perspective. The transformative, I just included it from the conversation that we shared with the representatives here with us, and that I think it's a crucial element to understand redress. How do we do this? With at least 4 basic elements as state obligations. One is to recognize the responsibility that the government has in the commission of crimes against humanity. Then recognizing victims and recording them as such. Also generating procedures, mechanisms and resources to create a real comprehensive redress process, and also adopting satisfaction measures, rehabilitation measures, compensation measures and redress measures, which is what international regulations propose. Different states need to ensure measures openly and continuously of the record of victims of tortures at any moment. And this has not happened in Chile. No victim should be out of this record. This is why we have the need, decades of need of a commission that can qualify the compliance of this for the states, taking into account the different recommendations of international organisms in this matter. The Constitutional Convention that we are now facing has embraced this very valuable initiative that indicates that Chile should understand torture as something different, as something as a continuous state policy, because it has been documented that torture happens in constitutional abnormality, but also in constitutional normality. The right to truth and impunity, it's not just a legal dimension that requires investigation, judgments, and sanctions with crimes against humanity, but also the right of truth has a social dimension because it restricts the opportunities of reconciliation between society and the state. It makes difficult the reconstruction of the social tissue, and it makes it more complex. The possibility of offering the guarantee of non-repetition. If we want this participative democracy, this is a fundamental dimension, the right for truth and fighting impunity. These reparation processes and their realization, the installation through consultation through victims and family members in all processes, that these issues address them. A very good sample of this is that the redress process for social outburst victims involves a very active participation of victims, families, and organizations. Also of general community, of the academy, experts, etc. But fundamentally, it starts from the involvement of families and people that were affected directly to define what they understand as redress. It is also crucial to understand that torture is a crime against humanity that affects people transgenerationally in society as a whole. The active participation of the affected society in their reparation is a guarantee to assure legitimacy, pertinence, efficiency, and success of these processes. On another hand, historical memory is another dimension of reparation of dignity of victims. The search plan that we have addressed is an obligation of the state that should be part of reparation. an understanding that widens the logic through which we look at the reparatory framework, and it is now a deeper need. And among them, one of the main elements is that we should understand that the violation of human rights exceeds the framework of dictatorships, and it makes it clear for us that this amplification is also towards other dimensions of the different crimes that might be committed by the state or by agents of the state against citizens. Understanding reparatory processes as something in development, that's also an element that we discussed yesterday with our guests. It's something very interesting to understand. As an act that, by definition, this should be an action, a continuous action. It's an unfinished act by definition. And I tend to think that it's an unconcluded act because of the permanent perfection, finding new ways of improvement, the search of reparation, not just for the person, but society as a whole. It's so important to keep this alive, and also as keeping alive the flame of participation and hope. In this way, a current state duty is to avoid torture. This requires investigation and sanction. This is a need where the debt of the state is huge, historically and currently. The typification of this crime is something that was done during the last decade, and this was because of the pressure of civil society before being a government initiative. Up to date, there are thousands of cases of torture in the context of dictatorship that have not been qualified. Therefore, they don't have access to any kind of redress. The Chilean state has a huge debt. There's not a support, and there's not legal support for those who are already qualified. They didn't have the right to a continuator organ that offered and guarantees the continuation of this process. Impunity in the historical dimension generates a higher tolerance for current torture. When this concept is ascribed to the radical forms as those that happened in the dictatorship, then we have a space for these practices to be reproduced. Torture is a means to find something else: information, silence, punishment. This goal can only be met when we address this issue from a reflexive approach that allows to visualize the existing links between torture and the issues of the current world, and in this way we undermine their tolerance. This supposes to create long-term policies and conceptual depth to support their cultural, intellectual basis and promote dialogue that widens acceptance of other ways of life and that supports the search of changing the reality of peaceful cohabitation. As a state, we have a very important commitment with democracy and commonwealth. We need to place our efforts into eliminating torture in our country. I don't believe that I had the honor of doing such an honorful task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Subsecretary. So next, we would like to invite Jens Christensen, the ambassador of Denmark in Chile. Good afternoon to everyone. The walls of this place host the memory, the proofs and testimony of torture, of exiliation, installed and executed by a dictatorship, and also the same walls built on democracy with a democratically elected president show that thanks to the fight of Chileans, with the efforts of the international entities and the permanent condemnation from the UN to the violence of human rights of the dictatorship, we were able to reinstate a democratic system. So for that reason, these walls bring hope. In consequence, there is no better place to celebrate the anniversary of the Fund of Contribution from the UN for Victims of Torture. We know that Chile is in the process of coming up with a new constitution, and we celebrate the discussion on how to ensure the human rights institutionally, because in the States we have a responsibility, a huge responsibility in the international entities that for Denmark are very important to safeguard human rights all over the world. Today, with victims of torture and women, I'm glad to say that Denmark was one of the main creators of the fund that we celebrate today. And despite being a small country, Denmark is the second biggest contributor to this fund, which provides the necessary rehabilitation and redress for the victims, their families, and organizations, because we know that the torture does not end at the time that the people who perform the torture are gone. Coming back to life is difficult and long, and I would like to use this opportunity to call the members of the UN to join and to contribute to this fund as an important element in the fight against torture and its nefarious effects. The fact that Denmark has taken many initiatives against torture is due to the fact that in its international policy, human rights are a priority for the Danish government or for the state, since for decades, regardless of political trends of the government, we have participated in the elaboration of plans against torture in New York and Geneva. In fact, we will present proposals against torture in New York in October and in March in the Council of Human Rights in Geneva. A state that considers the fight against torture can not only value and participate in the work of the institutions of the UN, and no one has to look the other way. As humanity, we have the challenge and responsibility of eliminating all uses of torture. As states, we have a double responsibility. We must constantly look at ourselves, our procedures and treatment, because we all have faults and we can all improve. And on the other hand, we have to strengthen our political and financial efforts fighting against torture. There are many people and organizations who have received support from this fund, and I only have to deeply thank the work done by the Voluntary Contribution Fund of the UN for Victims of Torture, and to call others to join. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador. We have a greeting from Darío Lagos, co-founder of IRCT. From its creation, the fund has supported different projects of organizations of the civil society in Latin America and the Caribbean, with different contexts and patterns of torture during the last 4 decades. An example of this in the region is the support of organizations in Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and many countries that have worked and continue to do this with survivors of torture and their families in the context of the dictatorship of the South Cone. We have provided support for families of disappeared people in Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Peru, and organizations in Salvador and Guatemala who assist victims of the armed conflicts in Central America, some based on support to indigenous peoples. Now we introduce Miss Emma Volchia Bravo, psychologist and survivor and founder of the Institute of Therapy and Investigation of Sequels of Torture and State Violence in Bolivia, who will share her experience with us. Good afternoon. A greeting, a solidarity greeting to the organizers of this event. A very respectful greeting to the personalities found here, to the representatives of the Chilean institutions and the organizations of Latin America. Allow me to express my deep respect, my solidarity, my identification with the people of Chile, with their fights, with their martyrs, and with all those people who still believe in a fair world and who still fight. Bolivia is a country that is marked by Spanish colonialism, by imperialism, first from England and then from the US. People that are fighting with their mining rebellions, indigenous rebellions, that are anti-colonial and anti-imperialism, marked by massacres, torture, and other types of organized violence from the state. The repression has been the only response from the dictatorships, governments, but also constitutionally elected, to the socio-economical demands of the poorer classes. In Bolivia, we didn't have a center that dealt with the rehab of affected people, that investigated the biopsychosocial sequels of torture on people, on families, on the communities. Upon the need of filling this void, we created the Institute of Therapy and Investigation on the Sequels of Torture, Violence of the State in 2001. We were born to the institutional life with the support of the Fund of Voluntary Contributions for Rehabilitation of Victims of Torture. We deeply thank this support, and we use this opportunity to congratulate you for this work. And also we would like to thank Paz Rojas, who's here, because on this first session that we requested the support, she was there and she recommended us. So thank you, Paz. We are an institution of human rights and mental health without profit purposes, non-for-profit. We work with the most vulnerable people, people who are lack freedom, women, indigenous peoples, teenagers, political refugees in Bolivia, migrants, and social sectors that are fighting for their rights. The LTA provides free services on primary medical attention, psychological attention, psychotherapeutic for affected people and their family core and their community. The attention is done on consultation, jails, and also attending to their demand. The multidisciplinary team of the ITE also deals with other regions of Bolivia when there are facts happening. We also work with formation of professionals, the operators of justice, indigenous populations, young people, sectors of the police and armed forces by providing courses, workshops, seminars, and conferences. We have positioned in the academy the topic of torture with a postgraduate in the Faculty of Humanity of the University of San Andres on the prevention of torture, protection of human rights, and rehab of affected people. We investigated the biopsychosocial sequels of torture at an individual level and collective as well. We perform incidence work with the government to sign international treaties, like it was the case of the ratification of the facultative protocol against torture, to modify, to increase laws and public policies. We have presented two proposals, a project of law against torture and for the creation of a national mechanism of prevention, and another one to modify the crime of torture on the criminal code according to international standards. We denounce and we fight with the affected people in their search for justice and redress, so the people who are responsible intellectually and materially can pay and to stop impunity in Bolivia. In a country like Bolivia, where torture is invisibilized, denied, and banalized, where the dysfunction of justice does not respect the presumption of innocence or the due process, where the police, exempt from an investigative mentality, makes torture the cheapest way of investigation, the work of DTE with the funding from the fund has been the only entity that has guaranteed the continuity, the care and rehabilitation to the affected people. This support from the fund has allowed us, in the 20 years of the institutional life that we have, to give a response to the needs of the affected people, to form a team of professionals that has become a referral in Bolivia and outside of it in the realization of psychological and medical investigation by using the Protocol of Istanbul to position the topic of torture in Bolivian society by impulsing the creation of a coalition against torture formed by institutions and networks of the civil society. This year, for example, last year, for the report to the Committee Against Torture, 14 organizations have joined and networks and have presented a common report. As you can see, we are no longer being like the Lone Ranger on the desert. With the help of the fund, we can keep doing our work, which is based on a political commitment focused on the construction of a fair society that is equal and respectful of human dignity. Thank you. Thank you, Emma. We keep getting greetings from overseas and also nationally. We have from the special relator on extrajudicial execution, Maurice Balbins, says, congratulations to the fund for their 40 years of their contributions to the dignity of victims of torture, who gladly bring the best example of fighting for human rights. And also Laura Blanco, congratulations to the fund for their brilliant work on these 4 years and for organizing this great and emotional event. CTI, we're glad to co-host you. Greetings from Geneva. We have also received the greetings from the Senator Fabiola Campillay through her assistant Carlos Astudillo, who is here today. Both people have been victims of violations to human rights by agents of the state during the democracy in the context of the social outburst, the manifestation that allows us to be coming up with a new constitution in democracy. To continue, we want... I'm sorry, I'm short-sighted. To continue, we want to present Tania Kolker, a doctor from the Estudios da Religião, Brazil, to address a few words.
Good afternoon. I would like to start by congratulating everyone and appreciating the opportunity of participating this commemorative event at this moment, precisely where Brazil presents once more a very serious situation when it comes to human rights. The first time that our team worked with a project of the UN was at the beginning of the 90s. Brazil had just finished a dictatorship that tortured, killed, and disappeared an unknown number of people, out of which they would only recognize a few hundreds, specifically those who participating in the political fight against the dictatorship. The other affected parties, among them thousands of Afro-descendants, indigenous and country people, never got their violations recognized, and they now suffer the consequences of impunity, invisibilization of their damages, and the forced elimination of their own memories. Up to then, no government had offered psychological attention to the victims of torture, and the only initiatives in that direction come from social movements like that one developed of No More Violence from Rio de Janeiro and the Fund for over 20 years. With Torture No More, did this performance on focusing on actions against torture and for memory, truth and justice. We already lived in democracy, but the wounds were still open and the violations to human rights did not decrease. On the contrary, with Brazil, the legacy was never overcome of centuries of slavery, as reparation only has benefited a limited number of affected people. And even more, partially or insufficiently, And with the end of the dictatorship did not mean the end of tortures or the demilitarization of police officers, the opening of repression archives, or clarification of deaths and disappearances, or punishment to torturers. The first policies that wanted to be redressed worked as a way of silencing victims, dissociating their rights for economic reparation and the other rights to truth, memory, and non-repetition measures that represented a lot of the repression apparatus that tried to justify the war against drugs, that focused their acting in the favelas. When we did start building this road, and Brazil started clarifying torture cases, establishing real committees and a psychological redress program for the affected persons, the President of the Republic, her herself, a former tortured and affected person, was taken from her position by unconstitutional ways. In previous years, the countries had gone through the building of very powerful public policies that in other ways had eliminated or had maintained under control some diseases, had taken millions of people out of poverty, had created Commonwealth institutions through reparation and redress policies for Afro-descendants. On the other hand, even that we continued the high rates of incarceration and high violations of human rights, the Brazilian government invested in building a national system for prevention and fight against torture. On the other hand, from 2013 and adding to the efforts of all other countries of Latin America that had moved in their justice processes, the Amnesty Commission created the project of psychological reparation that was interrupted by the government, had helped many people, at least in Rio de Janeiro. Our team had the opportunity of participating in this brief process, as in other initiatives destined to provide psychological repair to other affected people by violences of the state. When we started these projects, and the members of the Amnesty Commission were replaced by people that were aligned with repression of the past dictatorship. When we faced this stage on 2016, our team sent a new project to the Fund of Victims of Torture with the possibility of creating the NAPAVE. In the first year, most of the cases that we received came from people who lived or worked at favelas that were under intense control by the military police and being objects and subjects of almost daily shootings. In these places where people were subjects of random search when they worked at houses, and with the indication of obeying any instruction from the prosecutor, these kinds of measures did not have any limit. A police warrant could become a detention, torture, or persecutions. Many of them, having witnessed several shootings or finding dead bodies at their doorsteps could not avoid the fear of being the next victim, and a very powerful anxiety and depression set in, something that happened on their daily lives. Since 2018 and after the beginning of the current government, the number of victims of government violence increased, and deaths increased so much because of the interventions from the police and those done by military forces, facilitated not just by impunity and the roughness of militarization, but also the disarming of human rights policies. At this moment, most of the cases of Napave served came from mothers that had lost one, two, or even more of their children that were assassinated, or maybe they were forcibly disappeared. And this situation made more serious because of the COVID pandemic and because of the increase of unemployment and misery. This presented new challenges for us. Only on the first semester of 2020, in Rio de Janeiro, 3,000 people, over 3,000 people have been assassinated by the police. Especially after the current government started manifesting their support for lethal police nations and proposing changes on legislation to guarantee impunity. This without taking into account the forced disappearances, the under-registration murders of women, and assassinations of the LGBTQ plus indigenous people, environmentalists, and defenders of human rights. Encouraged by hate speech, by the state support, and the disarming of protection systems. And also measures to facilitate access to weapons and guns. In this same year, we recorded a high number of new guns, and the mechanism of against tortures and regarding cases and disappearance has been more difficult. Now, by 2021, despite the legal determination that for during the pandemic, more police operations were approved and police kept killing, and we reached the number of over 1,300 dead people and 61 massacres with multiple deaths. In the same way, at the end of last year, the pandemic caused the death of 620,000 people, and all of these deaths didn't even receive medical care. On the other hand, if during Dilma's government we reached outrageous numbers of people deprived of liberty because of the policy of war against the drugs, at the beginning of 2022 we reached almost 900,000 prisoners, many of them without sentences, and many of them without any investigation. When facing these violations that don't care for victims, when accessing different legal, social, and medical assistance, the annual subvention of the UN Fund for Torture Victims have been fundamental. This support not only made it possible to continue the assistance throughout the pandemic, but also the almost immediate follow-up for emergency situations as those of suicide attempts, or even after police operations that were violent. Currently, this scenario confirmed the importance of offering other kinds of supports besides listening to the psychic suffering, as this is not possible now to keep this hope of reparation, and as the very beneficiaries have said in the past, with these reparation measures, they started feeling this again. And our clinical current work, that is to offer psychosocial support and a safe space for victims of violence, contributed to the strengthening of their own community networks and providing support for building collective response for police persecutions and in favor of the right to justice and reparation. In its 5 years, NAPADE has embraced almost 500 people and has become a reference for the networks of families or victims. The profile of people comes from victims of tortures or families of assassinated or tortured young people, or young people that were subjected to forced disappearance, mostly from vulnerable sectors, but also former political prisoners and human rights advocates, health professionals that act in these areas that are more contingent. According to our experience, we were able to verify that the participation in this clinical group spaces and the possibility of understanding that this violence that is massive, recurrent, and mostly lethal comes from decisions or omissions coming from the government with intention, although apparently done autonomously by state agents. This makes it possible to have a subjective process of deculpabilization and hiding the facts. Another effect is the breaking of the silence of these violences that have been perceived as violences that are still meaningful. In this way, the process of collective caring, besides enabling the spaces of construction of other narratives and knowledge healing, and this provides different movements for personal growth and see more protagonism in their own fights against violations, and because of the right of justice, memory, and reparation. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Especially, thank you for the support of the fund.
Thank you, Tanya. Now, we are reaching the end. We would like to invite to this mic Ms. Vilma Abarzúa Cortés, member of CINTRAS, the Center of Mental Health and Human Rights, and a survivor from Chile. Go ahead, Vilma. Good afternoon. In this 40th anniversary of the Fund of the UN for Victims of Torture, I would like to greet all of you, virtual and presential attendants, to this ceremony of the 40 years of the Fund of the UN for Victims of Torture. In representation of CINTRAS, this Center of Mental Health and Human Rights, I would like to state our thankful and commitments for the purpose stated by the Fund of the voluntary contributions and with a deep conviction as a survivor of political prison and torture during the dictatorship in Chile, and the relevance of the actions performed by the NGO Sintras on everyone who has had access to all actions related to damages and the vulneration of our human rights, which has extended over time and has aggravated during and after the social outburst of October of 2019 in Chile, and the so-called victims and the survivors and the social and political and cultural context, and also due to the transgenerational damage of their health and sometimes unresolved by the institutions of the state created for that effect. Like this, Sintras, established since 1985 during the dictatorship as an entity that provides help besides others, and social attendance, kinetic. We can execute the funds from especially on survivors of torture by adequating to the times and demands of the spaces for attention, pandemic, and investigations, etc., from their own organizational goals and the countries and international in terms of human rights. We add other permanent actions of promotion and investigation on transgenerational damage and the transversality of this, and also doing the socio-historical analysis of the trauma in Chile from the clinical experience of pain, memory, and how current it is. The impunity is still the great challenge for the human dignity and the integral reparation. It will never be enough with any action destined to the redress and the rehabilitation. The relevance of the fund of the UN to the organizations that are non-profit that deal with promotion and defense of human rights in Latin America and the Caribbean, from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. For that reason, I cannot stop giving my opinion on the role of the state and the redress laws from the transition to democracy and its action from looking for truth and justice, defining impunity for the crimes of less humanity and the violators of human rights. My conclusions on my experience as a survivor and social referral from entities, users of the PRICE program, required me to do that. Regardless the conditions from inside the program and the specialized professional programs, I mean those who represent the state PRICE, the actions and political wills to fulfill their responsibility of the functions at the time of the technical regulations, among which we have the one stated on June 30 of 26 coming from the Ministry of Health, the Subsecretary of Public Health at the time, on a structural revision until 2021. The dignity and reparation are still reciprocity and participation according to the indicators and international standards for guarantees of non-repetition, truth, justice, the end of impunity, and memory. I would not like to stop intervening on this space without expressing how sensitive it is to be here, how sensitive it was in the morning to go through the museum and observing everything that this space implies, not only in terms of memory. This is a space of life, but life coming from death. And it was very difficult because I was in the opening in this space at the time. And it was so painful to live what was a dream, that we could see the traumatic experience from the violence and the state terrorism policy at the time. And I couldn't come back to the museum after 2 years. And that's where Sintras was. And it's still there until today. Even if I'm dirigent in Sintras, I have found what I couldn't find elsewhere, among others. And today I can talk, but I had a space of 25 years of silence before I could do it. I needed to have a brain issue to be able to say why it happened, from what the doctors could see and the experience. That's why when they said that torture leaves a mark, not only physically, there's also a mark in the soul. And being here, my daughters wanted to come, but they were also scared of coming, and they didn't. And that's the trauma that we call a social trauma, the transgenerational dimension that we have lived, those who have been through this process. And I cannot stop saying, because it's also a way of representing what happens in the family. The last chief of the CNI is the younger brother of my father. And in his family, we have many who have not talked. Another brother of my father. So when you leave that, I'm a teacher, a history teacher. I've always worked on public education. So when in the family you had to process everything you lived to be able to rebuild your life by marginalizing those who were, and in my case, the person who attacked me worked with my uncle. So I verbalized that I'm sorry if I have. So I think it's also a part of about not hiding the history of others who marked us for life and who are in our own families sometimes. And that's another part of painful part, because redress can come from doctors, can come from psychologists, psychiatrists, but the soul redress does not come, and sometimes that's the most painful one. So I'm thankful for the opportunity of participating here. We have met each other with Aide for many situations that we will keep going, and this reconstruction of my being, social being, how do you say it? Being able to keep contributing with a critical spirit, but with a lot of ethics, conviction, and hope that the country will come back to being what we once dreamed of. And that's the path until we have the will to live. Thank you. Thank you, Vilma, and thank you to all of these great women who are here with us today. To close this emotional ceremony, we want to invite Mr. Juan Mendez, member of the board of the Fund for Victims of Torture, for a few closing remarks. Thank you very much for the honor of leaving me up with the task of doing closing remarks for this act. As you can imagine, it's not easy after listening to so many emotional testimonies, but also so inspiring for us that we have heard from our speakers today. But I want to say that the operational focus that the fund tries to implement tries to add value to the work that we have heard from the organizations of the civil society. It's about providing means of direct assistance to ensure that no one gets left behind, but also to strengthen the civic space, to strengthen the social contract. The organizations that we support also benefits the society on the long term. It's about improving the climate of human rights in each country. It's about responding swiftly to the ever-growing humanitarian crisis on human rights with emergency subventions that the fund continuously gives. It's about guaranteeing significant participation from people in circumstances of vulnerability. It's about protecting people at risk as a previous condition to have a vibrant civic space. It's also about promoting participation channels that guarantee the fundamental liberties, and also about promoting the participation of victims in the design and execution of all these programs. To conclude, I would like to show the appreciation of my colleagues at the fund to the state of Chile and my own to the state of Chile for their commitment to the fund expressed in the organization of this great anniversary event, but also in its active role as a member of the group of friends of the fund, as a constant donor of the fund for many years. I thank the museum and its director, Mr. Francisco Esteves Valencia, and their team, to the Minister of Justice and Human Rights, and Minister Rios Tovar and their team, the Minister of External Affairs, Antonio Rejola Noguera, my friend, and the Subsecretary of Reuters and their team, to the initiative of the Convention Against Torture, the Ambassador of Denmark, Jens Godfredsen, as well as Peru, the co-presidents of the group of friends of the fund, to all donors of the fund, and I'm going to name the 21 who supported us in 2021: Germany, Saudi Arabia, Andorra, Austria, Canada, Chile, Denmark, the United States, France, India, Ireland, Italy, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Mexico, Norway, Portugal, Czech Republic, Qatar, Santa Sede, and Switzerland. The team of the Regional Office of the High Commissioner of the UN in Chile, Jan Jarab, Andrea Bervente, Felipe González, Isabel Margarita Hurtado, and Gabriela Tormund. The Secretary of the Fund at Geneva, Gartan Belier, who is here today, on their behalf, all of the colleagues of Geneva, especially to all beneficiary organizations of the world, and in particular, a very special greeting to Marit Saipatal from the CAP, Norma Ledesma Ortega from Justice for Our Daughters, Emma Bolchea Bravo from IJAI, Tania Golker from ISER, y Vilma Barzoa Cortez from Sintra. The efficient work dedicated and abnegated from all of you, and such solidarity work is a source of inspiration. Thank you very much. Before we finish, I would like to read one last greeting we got from the Secretary of the Fund of Geneva. Greetings and appreciation from the Secretary of the Fund of Geneva. We are excited to listen about so many friends, activists from the region who keep showing us the way. Special greetings to Paz and remembering the contribution from Roberto Garreton. Thank you so much to all of you, Claudia Jerez. And we also thank the Chilean authorities here, and we invite you to a honor wine on the way out. Thank you very much.